Hello, fellow readers and booktubers. We're only about 2 weeks before the end of the year, and tis the season when people like to put together their lists of their 10 favorite whatever, 10 favorite movies, 10 favorite TV shows, 10 favorite movie stars, and of course on BookTube, 10 favorite books of the year. And I've looked at a lot of other booktubers who've done this. I joined BookTube just this past August, so this would be my first opportunity to put together a top 10 list of my favorite books. And it sounds like a fun idea because I like to make lists just like everybody else does. And right away, I ran into three big obstacles, three things that kind of kept me from doing this. And the first of these had to do with the fact that I read widely. I don't just read one kind of book. It seems like a lot of top 10 lists deal with, novels, fiction. And I read fiction, I read novels, but I also read histories and different kinds of histories. I also read philosophy, I read theology, I read biographies, I read essays, I read memoirs, I read poetry. Within the area of fiction, I read different kinds of fiction. I read mysteries, I read science fiction, I read what is regarded as serious literature. And so how am I going to compare one book to the other and to come up with a list of the top 10 books if these books vary so widely in the kind of books that they are? This is the classic example of comparing apples to oranges. How is that even possible? How could I do this? And I noticed that some booktubers, though, did find a way to overcome this obstacle by creating different kinds of lists. They'll have these, here are my top 10 novels of the year. Here are my top 10 histories of the year. Here are my top 10, biographies of the year, and that kind of thing. And that seems pretty good to me. And I thought, well, maybe I should do that too. I'll just draw up a couple of different lists. But then again, another problem. I thought, well, my top 10 histories, should I do my top 10 ancient histories and my top 10 medieval histories and my top 10 modern histories? I don't know if I've read that many histories this year, but pretty soon I had to start specializing my choices and narrowing the field more and more and more until I would have to end up putting up about 20 lists. And I jealously guard my reading time, and it seems like drawing up that many lists would cut into my reading time quite a bit, and I didn't want to have to do that. Also, I'm kind of lazy, quite frankly. So I thought, but I do want to put up a list of some of the books that I read this year that meant something to me, but how am I going to make that choice? Also, I do reread books, the classics, generally speaking, everything from Homer to Dickens. I'll go back again and again to that. Well, or Shakespeare, of course, always shows up, and Dante. How do I put them on this list? How can I compare those eternal giants to writers of today? And who knows how many of them are going to be remembered 50 years from today? How do I do this? So that was the first obstacle I encountered in trying to put together this list. The second obstacle I had to overcome, and I'm sure by now you figured out what it is. I have a tendency to overthink things. Everyone else seems to have so much fun putting together their lists, and I really envy them for that. But because I overthink things, I freeze up, and what am I supposed to do with this? So that was obstacle number 2. And obstacle number 3, this one is a little harder to explain. I even wrote down some notes in advance on this one. Obstacle number 3 is simply that I like mostly everything that I read. It's not to say that I think everything I read is good, but maybe a better way of putting this is I respect anybody who can come up with an idea, put pen to paper, and articulate that idea, and write a book to completion, and then rewrite that book and rewrite it again and again and again until they have a nice polished gem of a book that satisfies them. And then they can take that to the publisher. And then the publisher might ask for some more rewrites, and then eventually the book appears in public. I admire anybody who's got that kind of stamina, that kind of tenacity, and that kind of talent to do something like that. Who am I to say, who cares? I've got to respect that. And I think especially those of us who are perhaps and let me be gentle with this one, failed writers. At one time, I had hoped to be a writer, and it just didn't happen for me. Some of that, as I said before, I'm kind of lazy. I'm not that disciplined. I hate to think maybe I didn't quite have the talent that I do have, but I never got to that point. So now I have to sit in judgment over those who accomplished something that I failed at. That doesn't seem right to me. I'm very uncomfortable with that. And in fact, when you draw up these lists, one of the ideas of the purpose of drawing up the list is to, generally speaking, put the books on a hierarchy, good, better, best. And usually when you see these lists, you're counting backwards, Here's the 10th greatest book. My favorite book of the year is the 9th, 8th, 7th. And now here's my most favorite book, the number one book of the year. How can you do that if you stand in awe of every book that you've read that year? How can you rank them like that? How can that be? And to compound that problem, I don't do I don't go much for the impulse buy when it comes to books. I will sometimes, but not as much as I used to. When I was younger, and I believed in my own immortality, I would often just pick up any book, anything that looked interesting. I would even buy books. I would judge them by their covers, by their length, what part of the bookstore they're in. Oh, science fiction, fine, throw it on the thing, and anything, because I thought I had all the time in the world. Well, I'm at a certain point in my life right now that I have to admit to myself that I have now lived more life than I'm going to live. The years behind me extend much longer than the years that are ahead of me. And I'm at a point in my life when, in the middle of the night, the unexpected ache or pain, or, a couple of, heartburn that seems to come out of nowhere. I've got a couple stents in my heart. My blood pressure seems to go up every year no matter what I do. I've really come to appreciate the fact that my time might be kind of limited, and I don't really have that vicarious, I'll just read anything that looks good. So what I do now is I go over the New York Times book review section. I like the Times Literary Supplement. Many of you out there, you booktubers, will recommend books that sound kind of interesting, and I read journals, and I take the advice of people whose opinions I respect, particularly in certain areas of writing, certain genres. Like if I want to read some science fiction, I know exactly who to go to. Now, not all those recommendations prove fruitful, but generally speaking, I'll be given some pretty good advice, and I'm going to like the book that has been recommended to me, because it has not been an impulse buy. It's been kind of carefully thought out. So now, end of the year, I have to put together a list which one was the best. Well, they're all good, and the odds that I would have read a really bad book are pretty slim, because I just was much more careful about the books that I chose. So, how do I overcome these obstacles? And I did find a way to overcome them, because I really wanted to make this list. I decided that instead of comparing books to books, instead of ranking good, better, and best, I would go through a reading journal that I've maintained for years and years and years. Now, this reading journal is just an old, I have a couple of old spiral notebooks, and I don't know what started me on this, but I started doing this maybe 30 or 40 years ago. Every time I would finish a book, I would just write down the name of the book and the author. I used to write little comments about the book, and at some point I got away from that. At any rate, right now I've just got all these notebooks that list every book that I read during any given year, and they're listed in chronological order, the order that I read them in. So I thought what I would do is I'll just go through my book journal for 2024, and I'll go month to month, and I'll just pick out the book that for whatever reason stuck with me. Now, this doesn't mean I'm going to, it doesn't necessarily mean it was a book that I thought was the best book I read that month, but it'll be the book that somehow succeeded in planting a flag in my memory. I can look at it and say, oh, I remember that one. That book I liked because it had an interesting concept in it. Or maybe some books just had an interesting quote or a certain viewpoint. So not necessarily the best of every month, but at least a book that was a standout for me for a whole variety of reasons. Which means, of course, my list of books for 2024, it's not going to be 10 books, it will be 12 books. And what about the classics that I read and reread? Well, I started the year reading Homer, which I've done many, many times in the past. Everything begins with Homer, right? However, there was another book in January that really struck me as quite interesting and all that. So when I was looking at my book journal, I said, well, of course I read Homer. Of course, Homer's a genius. Of course, Homer is an eternal. He's one of the Eternals. But this other book, there was something in this other book that really struck me. So when I go through this list of my 12 books of 2024, if I don't mention Homer, it doesn't mean I didn't read him. If I don't mention Shakespeare, you can assume that I've read some Shakespeare. I read Shakespeare every year. If I don't mention Dante, if I don't mention Charles Dickens, if I, the list just goes on and on. If I don't mention Suetonius or Tacitus, if I don't mention Thomas Aquinas or St. Augustine, you can assume they're there somewhere. Or even if I didn't read them during any given year, their ghosts will always haunt my lists. Okay, so don't be surprised if I don't mention some of the great classics that I've mentioned so many times in the past and that I've confessed my love for. If they don't show up on this list, that wasn't the criteria. The criteria is I look at each month and call out the book that really stuck with me, that really impacted me at that moment, or impacted me in such a way that even now, a few months later, I'm still thinking about it. So with that in mind, let's do this. January. I read, among other things, this book. This might be a shocker to some of you, but maybe not. The Meaning of the Monastic Life. You see that there? By Bouyer. The Meaning of the Monastic Life. Now let me explain this. First of all, Bouyer was a Catholic theologian. He was a priest. He lived through most of the 20th century. He died in 2004. This book was one of among many that he wrote about theology. He's also a social critic. This book was published in 1950, right? And I don't know if Bouyer was a monk himself. I don't think he was, but I do know that in the 1950s, for some reason that no one has been able to figure out quite yet, there was a huge influx of young men entering Catholic monasteries. It was just this weird kind of statistical glitch that occurred, and no one has quite understood why. But anyway, so he writes this book about the meaning of monastic life, and he describes what monastic life is all about. Personally, I've always been kind of attracted to the monastic life, but clearly it wasn't my calling. I married, raised a family, bought a house, pursued a career, and I'm very satisfied with all that stuff. But there's something about monks, the Catholic monk, living in that monastery that's always appealed to me, and it's always fascinated me. But whenever I would mention this to people, whenever I would mention my admiration for monks, almost every time the response would be, oh, what's with the monks? They're just running away from things. They're running away from their human responsibilities. They're running away from society. They're running away from, the troubles of the day. And Bouyer actually addresses this. And this is what stuck with me about this book. It was just one little observation. He says, the monk is not running away from anything. He's running towards something. He's running towards truth. He's running towards beauty. Say he's running towards God. And I thought that, oh yeah, well, there's the answer to that one. Very good. So this is my January book. All right, The Meaning of the Monastic Life by Bouyer. February, the book that really leapt out when I looked at my book journal was this one, Greek Myths and Christian Mysteries. This is by Hugo Rahner, also a Catholic priest. And by the way, before you all start clicking off, not all of these books have to do with Christianity or Catholicism. And I think this is the only other one that's also written by a Catholic priest. I'll get into the other stuff. I know some people get very touchy about religion. Some people are disgusted by it. Other people just become uncomfortable with it. But this is BookTube, and these are some of the books that I read that impacted me in a certain way. You don't have to read them, but I just wanted to be, honest about this. I do come from a Catholic background. But if you are uncomfortable with the talk of religion and Catholicism, this, I think, is the only other book on this list. But bear with me, because this book is really interesting, too. Greek Myths and Christian Mystery. Okay. Hugo Rahner. This book was published in 1963. Hugo Rahner died in 68. He was a classicist, meaning he studied ancient Greek and Roman civilization, particularly the Greek myths. And in this book, he was challenging a very common belief, or something that's a consensus among many ancient historians, that in the early decades of Christianity, what the Christians had done was appropriate the Greek and Roman myths, rework them, retool them, and use them to bolster an image of Jesus as a divine being. In other words, they would look at these Greek myths and, oh, well, here's a Greek demigod who could rise from the dead, or here's one who could fly up to the heavens, here's one who could cure people of their ills, here's one of uncommon wisdom. And they took these attributes and they kind of molded them to fit this first century Jewish rabbi. And so they're just appropriating these myths. And so the claims made for Jesus and early Christianity were just a retooling of these ancient myths, which of course completely devalues Christianity as a serious religious movement. But this is the common theme among the general consensus among historians. I haven't seen it in the textbooks that I use. Rahner, though, he says, oh, hold on a minute. That's not what was happening. His claim, and he did some serious research on this, he was a very well-respected historian. So this isn't just some kind of outlier. What he said, if you look more closely at the sources from the 1st and 2nd century, the Common Era, or the first 2 centuries of the Christian era, by that time, those Greek myths and those Roman myths were no longer accepted as real in any sense of the term. The old temples still were around. Many of them were falling into disrepair. You get mentions of this in all those ancient sources. The rituals to the ancient gods, those rituals were still being performed, but without the sense of sacredness or holiness about them. In other words, a prayer to Zeus probably had about as much religious meaning as a Thanksgiving dinner does to us. Those old myths and legends were just largely ignored. Everybody knew what they were, but they were moribund. They had become static. No one much cared anymore. All right. So when early Christianity comes along, the early Christians, in trying to convince people of this miraculous person that they had met, what they were doing was they would say things like, remember this God, this person who we believed was the son of a god who ascended into heaven? Remember that story? And yeah, I kind of remember that one. When did that happen exactly? Who knows? These myths, back in some mythical time. The Christian would say, well, you know what? There really was somebody like that. I can tell you exactly when he lived, during the reign of the Emperor Tiberius, when Pontius Pilate was the governor of Judea. They can pinpoint a moment in time when all these strange stories, these strange myths and legends all suddenly came true. And so what Rahner is arguing here is the early Christians didn't appropriate these ancient myths and tweak them for their own purposes. They referenced them and they breathed new life into them to emphasize that these ancient miracles had actually come true. Now, again, I'm not trying to convince anybody of anything, but Rahner kind of made me think twice about that whole idea of the early Christians just ripping off the Greek mythologies for their own purposes. This is a wonderful book. I think it deserves a lot more attention, a lot more respect than it gets. And so anyway, that was my February book. My March book, we're going to stick in, now we're going to get away from the Christian thing, but we're going to stick in we're going to maintain our focus on the ancient world. This was a book by Caroline Alexander called The War That Killed Achilles. And of course, that war is the Trojan War. This is a wonderful analysis of the myth of the Trojan War and the claims for its historicity. Caroline Alexander, she herself is an historian and a classicist. She published her own translation of the Iliad not too long ago. Great writer. I really enjoyed this. This book was published in 2009. What I really liked about it, though, is that she restored some poignancy to this story. There's a tendency to look at the different myths regarding the Trojan War and the person of Achilles and Hector and all the rest of them as these giant heroic beings, who picked up giant boulders and threw them at each other and could, and that would commune with the gods and all of this. And, Miss Alexander's interpretation of these things isn't whether, well, was that true or not? That's just chasing after, myths, chasing after shadows. What she's saying is, what did this poem, what did the Iliad, what is it really saying? What do these stories about the Trojan War really have to say? And what she is saying is, these poems are actually saying, war is terrible. No matter how you cut it, there might be heroes, but just under the feet of those heroes are the common people whose lives are being destroyed. And I just want to read her concluding paragraph here to give you some idea about why I remember, of all the books that I read in March, why I remembered this one the best. She writes, the Iliad never betrays its subject, which is war. Honoring the nobility of a soldier's sacrifice and courage, Homer nonetheless determinedly concludes his epic with a sequence of funerals, inconsolable lamentations, and shattered lives. War makes stark the tragedy of mortality. A hero will have no recompense for death, although he may win glory. That's very powerful stuff. That's very serious business here. So, The War That Killed Achilles by, I keep forgetting, I keep wanting to call her somebody, Caroline Alexander. I keep messing up her name. But a wonderful book by a wonderful author, a wonderful historian. So that's January, February, and March. Get to April. Still in the ancient world. And I want to emphasize, these are not the only books that I was reading. I was reading other books and novels and everything else, but my standout book from April was Vergil, The Poet's Life by Sarah Ruden. Ruden herself is a poet, but also another classicist and a translator of Homer, of Vergil, of Aristophanes, St. Augustine, steeped in the ancient world. And she put together this wonderful biography of the Roman poet Vergil. We don't really know a lot about Vergil's life, so of course it's a very thin book, but it's a very enjoyable read. The standout here is that Ruden has a kind of a snarky attitude, which makes it kind of humorous at times. One thing in particular that I remembered about this, she was discussing the Roman statesman Cato the Younger. And Cato was around at the time of Vergil. This is the 1st century before the Common Era, during the great upheaval of the Roman Republic, Julius Caesar's assassination and the civil wars and all that business. And Cato was this illustrious Roman senator. But Ruden writes that Cato, that old gas bag, blah, blah, blah. That just made me laugh. We have a tendency to look at these individuals from antiquity in the most reverent kind of ways, but she just says, he's an old gas bag. And she refers to some other famous figures from ancient history in the same way. This wonderfully iconoclastic attitude. So Sarah Ruden's The Poet's Life, Vergil. It's a very good book, too. She really just pulled together a lot of information to try to make a comprehensive portrait of Vergil, which is not easy to do. Then in May, guess what? Still talking about Vergil. In addition to all the other books I was reading, I want to emphasize this. This is Vergil, Father of the West by Theodor Haecker. Now, as I said, when I was going through my book journal, I would just, the books that I remembered the most or that stuck with me the most would be the ones I would reference and put on my list. Didn't necessarily mean it was the best book of that month. This is a good book. It's interesting because it's so, I remember it struck me as very odd. Not sure I would recommend it unless you're a serious student of Vergil. What struck me as odd about it was that this book was written in Germany in the 1930s. That was at the rise of the Nazis and Hitler, and all that horror show was unfolding at the time. Haecker, he was no Nazi. He was very much opposed to the whole Nazi thing. But he was a classicist as well and a social critic. And he really saw Vergil in these glowing terms as the great figure from antiquity who represented the best in human nature. There were times when I think Haecker was confusing Vergil with Aeneas, who was the major figure in Vergil's famous poem, the Aeneid. I think he was confusing these two figures a little bit, conflating them somewhat. But The Nazis were very suspicious of Haecker. They're always pulling him into the police station and beating him up, but they could never quite figure out. They sensed that he didn't like them, and he didn't like them, but they couldn't quite figure out what it was. And that's largely because fascists in general aren't the brightest people. Somehow Haecker avoided execution. He avoided the death camps. He lived, from what I understand, he lived in Germany till the end of the war, and then for a few years after that. I don't know how he avoided these things. But what makes this book interesting, it's the way he praises Vergil is just, I don't want to say over the top, it's just unusual. But he says, Vergil represents the best of the Western world, and it's important to return to what Vergil represented. He represented integrity, a sense of a higher purpose, and mostly pietas. Pietas is where we get the English word piety. It means a humility before tradition and honor of God or the gods in Vergil's case. Now, these are the very things that the Nazis opposed. The Nazis didn't like this idea of personal integrity. The Nazis tried to replace the ideals of humanism with the incredibly brutal kind of anti-ideology of fascism. And they knew that Haecker didn't approve of what they were doing, but they couldn't quite nail him on it. But interesting book. It's kind of odd. I might return to it someday, but it did attract my attention and stir my memory of the books that I read in May. Okay. And then we get to June, and guess what? Another book about Vergil. I posted on this book, The Death of Virgil. This was published in 1945. One of the best novels I've ever read. I did a separate post on it a few months ago when I first read it. You're certainly free to reference that if you like to. I don't see any need in repeating everything about it, other than it was a great novel. And I think in my earlier post about this, I had said something like, whenever you see a list of the 100 greatest novels of the 20th century, this book is like 103 on that list. In other words, it doesn't quite make the list. I would argue it should be on that list, maybe near the top 10. I've never read anything like it. It's historical fiction. It's a fictional account of the last 3 days of Vergil's life. It is written as stream of consciousness, which I usually don't like. I'm always suspicious of that style of writing. But this is a kind of disciplined stream of consciousness. And it goes deep. And it's not the consciousness of the author, Hermann Broch, by the way, is the author, Hermann Broch. It's not his consciousness that he's streaming. Somehow he's streaming Vergil's consciousness, which is a tour de force in creative thinking. But he does it quite well. And so this was the book that really stood out for me in June. Hermann Broch's The Death of Virgil. This is one I strongly recommend. And then we get to July, and we're not quite out of the ancient world yet. We're almost done with the ancient world. But when I looked at the books I read in July, this is the one that leapt out at me. The Memoirs of Hadrian. Hadrian, one of the Roman emperors. This is by Marguerite Yourcenar. I'm never quite sure if I'm pronouncing her name properly. This was published in 1951. It was an instant bestseller in France, and then it was translated into English about a year or two later and became a big bestseller in the United States. And it's still studied and read today. I know it shows up on a lot of reading lists in high schools and colleges, as well it should. It's a fictional rendering of the life of the Emperor Hadrian. And again, Yourcenar, she's done her research. She knows what she's doing. There's some gaps in her understanding of Hadrian's life. Well, this is a fictional account, so she's able to creatively fill in those gaps, but she does it in a very convincing way. And it's very well written, okay? A beloved, fictionalized account of the life of one of Rome's good emperors. Put that good in quotes. The Romans had 5 emperors. They called the good emperors. Hadrian was one of them. And here's a novelization of this, of Hadrian's life. Very good stuff. And that brings us to the end of summer in August. And we're going to leave the ancient world behind at last. Although, again, I was reading other stuff, but it was books about the ancient world that stuck with me. But when we get to August, where do you see this? This is the book that stood out for me, the complete essays of Montaigne in 3 volumes, 3 beautiful a box set of the essays of Montaigne, that wonderful 16th century French nobleman and essayist. Now, I just want to add that when I say this is the book that was recorded in my journals for August, it just means that I finished reading this in August. I started it at the beginning of the year. My intention was to read an essay a day. Now, some of Montaigne's earlier essays were very short, some of them only a page or two long, but as you get deeper into his writing, some of his essays are very long indeed. In fact, one of his essays is usually published separately as a book in its own right. That's the, let me find it out here. Oh, that's the Apology for Ramon Simon. That's a book in itself, but that's in the set. So anyway, my intention was to read one essay a day. Sometimes I'd read 2 or 3 essays. Some of the essays were pretty long, and I'd stretch it out for a couple of days. There'd be other days when I'd get involved with something else, and I would forget to read my Montaigne. But I set it, I set my sights on, I was going to read all of Montaigne this year, and I did. This set, by the way, this was published early in the 20th century. I picked it up at a used bookstore. Got a pretty good price for it. It's not, all 3 essays do not have, all 3 volumes do not have essays by Montaigne. It's just volumes 1 and 2, the complete essays of Montaigne. Volume 3 is filled with citations, or Montaigne might, it's called the Montaigne Handbook. Montaigne quite often would quote other authors from antiquity, and so in the handbook here, there are a lot of explanations of Montaigne's references. And also in this, every essay gets a little summary and a little commentary about it. Those commentaries were written by a Montaigne scholar by the name of Grace Norton, who I'm unfamiliar with. She's probably very famous. But so she wrote like little commentaries or criticism of each essay. And so I wanted to read those too. However, she was pretty damning about some of Montaigne's essays. She would say, oh, this essay is not worth reading. This one, he loses his focus. This one is empty. This one just trails off into nothing. And I was thinking, oh my gosh, at first I would read the criticism and then I'd read the essay. But sometimes these criticisms were so damning, it was hard for me to get to the essay. But I did get to the essay, and I thought I'd read the criticisms after I read the essay. And then it helped quite a bit. And Miss Norton, although she was very generous in her praise, and with the essays that she did like, and some of these essays are still quite influential and appreciated today. Montaigne wrote essays about everything, and he wrote in this very relaxed manner. And he wasn't shy, but he wrote everything about politics, religion, and sex. And, he was a man of great privilege, but he lived simply. When he was around, France was steeped in the wars of religion. French Protestants were killing French Catholics, and Montaigne kind of stayed out of that. He inherited a wonderful villa in the countryside of France, and he just wanted to spend his life reading and writing and thinking about things, which sounds like the perfect life to me. And out of this came these wonderful essays. And if you've never read Montaigne, I would recommend that you do. You don't have to get a 3-volume set. Montaigne's, all of his essays, I know there's a Penguin edition of his complete essays, one of those big, thick Penguin paperbacks. But there are also other editions of Montaigne's essays that are the selected essays. Some of his essays are considered the best of their kind. So you should always have some Montaigne around the house. I'm just lucky that I've got this great 3-volume complete Montaigne. So that was my reading for August. Oh, and again, I finished Montaigne in August. I didn't read all 3 volumes in August, but I finished them in August. So that gets us into the fall, September 2024. The next book I'm going to mention is, I'm pretty sure everybody watching this read this novel. I think everybody on YouTube posted about this novel. Every list of the best books of 2024, no matter who drew up the list or what criteria they were using, have this book on the list, and it's James by Percival Everett. I did a separate posting on this book as well. I don't know what more I can say about it that hasn't already been said. Possibly the, if not the great American novel, right up there in the top 5. This book will be read and studied, I hope, for generations to come. If you're one of those few people who are unfamiliar with this book, essentially what it is, it's a rewriting of Mark Twain's Huckleberry Finn, but seen through the eyes of the slave Jim. That's the James. It's filled with humor, tragedy, it's heartbreaking, it's honest, it's uncompromising, just a wonderful novel. It's won all kinds of awards, and it deserves every single one of them. If you haven't read James, you really owe it to yourself to read this one. So that was my standout book from September. I think of all the books I mentioned, this is the first one that was actually published this year. All the others were published years and years ago. And then another novel for my October choice, which I also posted about, was this book called Storm. This was first published in 1941 by George Stewart. It's considered the first echo novel, echo as in the ecology. The main character in this novel is, I'll put it closer for you. The main character in this novel is a storm that is born in the Pacific, comes to fruition, and then dies out. So the storm is described as this like living organism. It's not science fiction though, it's a real storm. But the point of the novel is how storms develop and take shape and gain force, and how they affect the lives of people in all different areas of life. I know that doesn't sound very intriguing, but it's just so well written that it just pulls you right along. George Stewart was an historian and a novelist. He wrote a number of different novels. One of his novels is called The Earth Abides. And I think that was published maybe about 5 or 10 years after this one. And again, it deals with an ecological catastrophe. And it's considered one of the first of the modern science fiction novels, of the 1950s and into the 60s. Recently, I saw coming attractions or previews for I don't know if it was a movie or a miniseries. I think it's on Netflix. It's called Earth Abides, and it's based on this guy's novel. Of course, they've updated everything, but George Stewart, a good writer, not to be ignored, and this is a very interesting book. I never read anything quite like it, and it was really well written, and it just pulls you right along. There's a great narrative drive here. That Storm. That was my my October book. And then in November, I read Harold Bloom's Take Arms Against a Sea of Troubles. Harold Bloom was, of course, one of the greatest literary critics of the 20th century and into the 21st century. This book was published in 2020. This was Bloom's last book. It was published about a year after he had died. There might be some other manuscripts out there that are going to be published posthumously. Anyway, but this book is very good. Bloom, some people love him, some people hate him. I'm kind of on the fence towards loving him. He's always interesting. This book is kind of a master class in the study of the Romantic poets. But there's also, he does mention his current circumstances as he was writing this. He was quite ill. And at times he kind of goes off into a reminiscence about all of his colleagues in the colleges and universities where he taught, how all of them have died, and how he's very sick. In one chapter here, he's dictating from his hospital bed. There's a very sad autumnal mood here. What kept Bloom going was his love of the great Romantic poets, and he could just recite them from memory, and his analysis of these poets. And so and the subtitle of this is The Power of the Reader's Mind Over a Universe of Death. Very dramatic stuff, but that's what he's getting at here. As long as you can read, as long as you can appreciate what you read and remember what you read, death doesn't really have any hold over you. I like that very much. Harold Bloom. And then my last book of the year in December. Oh yes, one more thing about this book. I finished reading this in November. I had started this earlier in the year, kind of like the Montaigne book. Again, the chapters in here are almost like standalone essays about the various poets, Shelley. He's got a wonderful section in here about Whitman and Byron and all the rest. But anyway, I finished reading this in November. Okay, so, and again, I would read a chapter, then go on to some other things, and then come back to it again and again. Bloom is not an easy read. He assumes that you know various things about poetry. It'd be as if you were taking a class in college and you signed up for this advanced study of poetry and you'd never studied poetry before, the professor is going to give you a quick introduction into things. He's going to assume you know these things. And some of the stuff I did know what he was talking about. Other things I had to do a little extra research to bring myself up to snuff to appreciate this. But anyway, the point is, this is my November book. Even though I had started it earlier, I finished it in November. Excuse me. And my last book of the year, and I posted on this one just recently. I think it was just last week, Poetry Thursday, I read a poem by Wendell from this book, The Peace of Wild Things. Barrie is the great American poet of our time. I don't know that anyone comes close. As I mentioned in my post last week, I was happy to see he's still with us. He's 90 years old. The great poet of the land, the great poet of humanity and man's connection with the land. Just very powerful, a wonderful collection of books. And I was surprised to find out this was published in 2018, but some of the poems in here go back to the 80s and the 70s and the 60s and all of that. But this is my 12th book, The Peace of Wild Things by Wendell Berry. So that's my list. As odd as it might be, those are my 12 books for 2024. Let's see what's coming up. Christmas is coming up, and then the New Year's. There'll be a few more posts before the year ends. But until then, keep reading and hang in there. And I hope you have a very happy Christmas and a joyful New Year. That's all for now.